Before the name of the Lelantine War ever appeared in later Greek memory, before poets and historians tried to make sense of it, the conflict was already quietly forming in ambition, rivalry, and fear, the kind of fear that grows when prosperity itself becomes a threat. Imagine the Aegean world in the late 8th century BCE, a time when Greece was not yet Greece as we know it, but a fragile network of rising city-states, each struggling to survive, expand, and control the lifelines of trade that meant the difference between wealth and ruin. On the island of Euboea, two cities stood as pioneers of this new age, Chalcis and Eretria. They were neighbors, rivals, and once, crucially, partners. Together they had pushed Greek influence westward, jointly founding the colony of Cumae in Italy around 750 BCE, opening profitable trade routes that funneled metals, grain, and prestige back to the Aegean. At first, this shared success bound them together, but success has a way of sharpening competition rather than softening it. As trade expanded and colonial networks grew, both cities began to ask the same dangerous question: who truly controlled the wealth flowing through the Greek world? The answer mattered because the Lelantine plain lay between them, a fertile stretch of land that could feed armies and sustain populations. In an era when food security meant power, control of that plain was not a minor dispute but a strategic necessity. Chalcis, with its strong cavalry tradition and aristocratic landholders, saw the plain as its natural inheritance. Eretria, wealthier from maritime trade and colonies, believed economic strength gave it equal claim. What began as diplomatic tension slowly hardened into hostility. Old alliances were tested, marriages between elites lost their political value, and trade agreements quietly collapsed. Across the Aegean, other Greek cities watched closely, because this was no isolated quarrel. The balance of power was shifting, and whichever city emerged dominant would influence trade routes stretching from Anatolia to southern Italy. Politics in this era were personal and brutal. Decisions were not made in grand assemblies but among elite families whose fortunes were tied to land, ships, and armed followers. In Chalcis, aristocrats feared being boxed in by Eretrian sea power, worried that Eretria's alliances with eastern Greek cities like Miletus could choke off access to key markets. In Eretria, leaders saw Chalcis as an aggressive land power whose cavalry could threaten not only the Lelantine plain but Eretrian independence itself. Suspicion turned into preparation. Weapons were stockpiled, alliances quietly negotiated, and messengers crossed the seas carrying promises of support. The Greek world began to split, not along ideological lines, but according to shared interests and old grudges. Samos, Corinth, Thessaly, and perhaps Eretria leaned toward Chalcis, seeing stability or advantage in supporting a strong land-based ally. Miletus, Megara, and possibly Chios sided with Eretria, drawn by trade connections and mutual distrust of Chalcian dominance. By around 750 BCE, the tension reached a breaking point. No single battle marked the official beginning of the Lelantine War. Instead, raids, skirmishes, and acts of retaliation spiraled into sustained conflict. Farms were burned, border settlements attacked, and merchant ships seized. Each act demanded a response, and every response escalated the violence. For the first time in Greek history, according to later tradition, there was even talk of agreed limits on warfare, such as bans on missile weapons like javelins, suggesting how deeply the conflict disturbed existing norms. Whether fully accurate or not, these stories reflect a reality in which Greeks were confronting the terrifying possibility of large-scale, prolonged war between their own people. The early phase of the war was defined by uncertainty. Chalcis relied heavily on its cavalry, drawn from aristocratic horse-owning families who dominated its politics. On the flat fields of the Lelantine plain, mounted forces could devastate enemy infantry and disrupt supply lines. Eretria, by contrast, leaned on its naval strength and overseas wealth, using ships to strike at Chalcian trade and pressure its allies. The war was not confined to Euboea. Because both cities had extensive colonial and commercial ties, fighting echoed across the Aegean and beyond. Allies were pulled in not always by loyalty, but by fear of what might happen if they remained neutral. To stand aside was to risk isolation once a victor emerged. The human cost began to mount quickly. Small farmers lost their land as armies marched back and forth across the countryside. Trade slowed as sea routes became dangerous, affecting cities far from the fighting. Young men were drawn into a conflict whose outcome no one could predict, fighting not for abstract ideals but for survival and honor in a world where defeat could mean exile or enslavement. The war also exposed a deeper transformation underway in Greek society. As hoplite warfare began to emerge, with heavily armed citizen soldiers fighting in formation, the balance of power within city-states was shifting. War was no longer the exclusive domain of aristocratic champions. It demanded broader participation, and that participation would eventually reshape politics across Greece. As the Lelantine War dragged on year after year, it became clear that this was more than a local feud. It was a struggle over the future of Greek expansion, trade, and power at a critical moment in history. The alliances forming around Chalcis and Eretria hardened divisions that would echo for generations. Even in these early stages, the war had already achieved something dangerous. It normalized the idea that Greek cities could be locked in long, destructive conflict with one another, drawing the wider world into their struggle. The opening phase set the tone for decades of instability, ambition, and loss, with no clear end in sight and no easy path back to peace. As the Lelantine War moved beyond its uncertain beginnings, it hardened into a grinding struggle that reshaped not only Chalcis and Eretria but the wider Greek world that had been pulled into their rivalry. What had started as raids and localized clashes now became sustained warfare driven by strategy, alliances, and survival. Both cities understood that victory would not come from a single decisive battle but from exhausting the other economically, politically, and militarily. Chalcis pressed its advantage on land, repeatedly pushing into contested territory on the Lelantine plain, while Eretria answered by striking outward, using its naval reach to undermine Chalcian trade and punish its allies. The war expanded geographically as allied cities honored commitments or were dragged in by circumstance, turning Euboea into the center of a conflict whose effects rippled across the Aegean Sea. Thessaly's support proved critical for Chalcis during this phase. Thessalian cavalry had a reputation for speed and discipline, and their involvement strengthened Chalcis's already formidable mounted forces. On open ground, Eretrian infantry struggled to counter these attacks, suffering repeated losses that forced Eretria to rethink its strategy. Eretria responded by avoiding large-scale land engagements whenever possible, focusing instead on controlling the sea lanes that fed Chalcian wealth. Eretrian ships targeted merchant vessels moving between Euboea, Asia Minor, and the western colonies, disrupting the flow of grain, metals, and luxury goods. Every seized cargo weakened Chalcis's ability to pay soldiers and maintain alliances, and every lost ship sent a message that Eretria's power reached far beyond the battlefield. Meanwhile, Miletus and Megara intensified their involvement on Eretria's side. Miletus, already a major power in the eastern Aegean, saw the war as an opportunity to curb Chalcian influence and protect its own trade interests. By providing ships, resources, and possibly experienced fighters, Miletus helped Eretria remain competitive despite setbacks on land. Corinth's alignment with Chalcis added another layer of complexity. Corinth controlled key trade routes through the isthmus and had its own colonial ambitions, particularly in the west. Supporting Chalcis meant supporting a partner whose dominance could stabilize Corinthian trade networks, even as it risked provoking Eretria's maritime allies. The war thus became a chessboard of shifting pressures, where each city calculated not just immediate gains but long-term survival. The fighting itself was brutal and personal. Unlike later classical wars with massive armies and formal declarations, this conflict was fought through seasonal campaigns, surprise attacks, and relentless attrition. Villages near the Lelantine plain were abandoned or destroyed, their populations displaced or absorbed into other communities. Agricultural cycles were disrupted year after year, leading to shortages that affected civilians as much as soldiers. The psychological toll was immense. Families waited for sons who might never return, while city leaders faced constant pressure from elites and common citizens alike, all demanding victory but fearing ruin. In this environment, compromise became almost impossible. To seek peace was to admit weakness, and weakness invited destruction. As casualties mounted, estimates suggest that hundreds, possibly thousands, lost their lives over the decades of intermittent fighting, a staggering number for city-states whose populations were measured in the tens of thousands at most. Beyond the dead, the wounded and displaced formed a silent majority whose suffering rarely made it into later accounts. Economically, the war drained resources at a time when Greek cities depended heavily on trade and agriculture. Eretria, despite its naval successes, began to feel the strain of maintaining fleets and supporting allies far from home. Chalcis, though strong on land, struggled as trade disruptions reduced income and increased dependence on allies whose loyalty could never be guaranteed. One of the most significant developments during this middle phase was the transformation of warfare itself. The increasing use of hoplite infantry, heavily armed citizens fighting shoulder to shoulder, began to replace older forms of aristocratic combat. This shift reflected deeper social changes. As more citizens were called upon to fight and die, demands for political influence grew. While these changes would take centuries to fully mature, the Lelantine War accelerated the process by forcing city-states to mobilize broader segments of their populations. War was no longer just an elite contest. It became a collective burden that reshaped civic identity. The conflict also left a mark on Greek colonization. Some colonies founded by Chalcis and Eretria suffered as support from their mother cities dwindled. Others gained unexpected independence as the war distracted their founders. In Italy and the Western Mediterranean, rival colonial networks adjusted to shifting power balances, sometimes aligning with one side, sometimes exploiting the chaos to advance their own interests. The war thus indirectly influenced the spread of Greek culture and power far beyond the Aegean, shaping patterns of settlement and trade for generations. Despite moments when one side appeared close to dominance, neither Chalcis nor Eretria could deliver a decisive blow. Every advantage was met with resistance, every victory balanced by loss. This prolonged stalemate deepened divisions across Greece and normalized the idea of interstate warfare as a tool of policy. By the time the war entered its later years, it had already achieved a grim legacy. It taught Greek cities how to fight each other on a scale and duration previously unknown, setting a precedent that would echo through later conflicts like the Persian and Peloponnesian Wars. The middle phase of the Lelantine War was thus not just a continuation of violence but a turning point, where rivalry hardened into a model of war that would define Greek history itself. By the time the Lelantine War entered its later phase, exhaustion had settled into the bones of every city involved, yet the conflict showed no sign of fading. Instead, it evolved, becoming more complex, more destructive, and more unpredictable. What had once been driven by the rivalry of two Euboean neighbors now functioned as a loose but dangerous system of interconnected wars, where a clash in one region could trigger consequences hundreds of miles away. Generations had grown up knowing nothing but tension with rival cities, and for many young men, war was no longer an extraordinary event but an expected duty. This normalization of conflict hardened attitudes on both sides and made reconciliation increasingly unlikely. Chalcis, despite its early advantages, began to feel the long-term cost of sustained warfare. Aristocratic cavalry remained effective, but maintaining horses, armor, and trained riders required resources that were steadily diminishing. Trade disruptions caused by Eretrian naval actions and pressure from Eretria's allies meant fewer goods, less silver, and growing internal strain. The social divide between elite horsemen and common infantry widened, fueling resentment that quietly undermined unity at home. Eretria, meanwhile, faced its own crisis. Its reliance on maritime power demanded constant shipbuilding, skilled crews, and steady supplies of timber and bronze. Losses at sea were harder to replace than fallen infantry, and every sunken ship represented not only military defeat but economic disaster. As the war dragged on, fighting became increasingly opportunistic and ruthless. Surprise attacks replaced formal engagements. Coastal settlements were raided at dawn, ships ambushed near familiar harbors, and alliances tested by sudden shifts in loyalty. Some allied cities, drained by years of contribution, began to reduce their involvement, offering symbolic support rather than real forces. Others saw opportunity in the chaos. Neutral powers maneuvered carefully, trading with both sides while preparing defenses in case the conflict spilled into their territory. The Greek world had become a tense web of calculation, where survival depended on reading the shifting balance of power correctly. The cumulative damage was staggering. Large sections of the Lelantine plain lay abandoned or underused, their soil soaked not only with blood but with the memory of repeated destruction. Food shortages became more common, forcing cities to rely increasingly on imported grain, which in turn made them vulnerable to naval disruption. Population loss through death, displacement, and migration altered demographics in lasting ways. Some families fled permanently to colonies, seeking stability far from Euboea, while others were absorbed into allied cities as refugees. These movements quietly reshaped Greek society, spreading traditions, grievances, and stories of the war across the Mediterranean. Politically, the conflict eroded old systems of authority. Leaders who promised quick victory lost credibility as years passed without resolution. In both Chalcis and Eretria, pressure grew for new approaches, whether through harsher military measures or risky diplomatic overtures. Yet diplomacy was poisoned by memory. Too many betrayals, broken truces, and atrocities stood in the way of trust. Even when temporary ceasefires occurred, they were fragile pauses rather than steps toward peace. Each side feared that laying down arms would invite annihilation. The wider Greek world watched and learned. City-states observed the consequences of prolonged war, economic strain, social upheaval, and political instability. At the same time, they absorbed tactical and strategic lessons. The value of alliances, the importance of controlling trade routes, and the necessity of mobilizing citizen soldiers became increasingly clear. The Lelantine War thus functioned as an unplanned training ground for Greek warfare, shaping how future conflicts would be fought. It demonstrated that wars between Greeks could be as devastating as those against foreign enemies, a realization that would echo ominously in centuries to come. By the late 8th to early 7th century BCE, signs of decline became unmistakable. Eretria, once a dominant maritime power, suffered losses that permanently weakened its influence. Chalcis, though surviving as a city-state, never fully regained the prominence it had enjoyed before the war. Neither side achieved the total victory they had once imagined. Instead, both emerged diminished, their resources spent and their ambitions curtailed. The war did not end with a dramatic treaty or a decisive final battle. It faded unevenly, leaving behind unresolved tensions and a landscape permanently altered by decades of conflict. The true legacy of the Lelantine War lay not in clear winners or losers but in the precedent it set. It showed that Greek city-states were capable of sustaining long-term, multi-regional warfare driven by economic competition and political fear. It exposed the fragility of alliances and the heavy price paid by ordinary people caught between elite ambitions. Perhaps most importantly, it marked a turning point in Greek consciousness. War was no longer an episodic clash remembered for generations. It became a recurring condition of political life. As the fighting slowly receded, its lessons remained embedded in Greek memory, shaping how cities would prepare for, justify, and endure the wars that defined their future. As the echoes of open fighting began to fade, the aftershocks of the Lelantine War continued to shape the Greek world in quieter but no less powerful ways. The end of large-scale hostilities did not bring true peace. Instead, it left behind a fractured landscape where trust was scarce and memories of loss guided political decisions. Chalcis and Eretria, once bold pioneers of Greek expansion, now faced the difficult task of survival in a world that had moved forward without them. Their rivalry had consumed decades, drained generations, and altered the balance of power so deeply that even distant cities felt its consequences. What remained was a Greek world permanently changed by one of its first great internal wars. Eretria's decline was especially visible. Once wealthy from maritime trade and colonial networks, it struggled to recover from sustained naval losses and economic disruption. Ships that had once carried Eretrian influence across the Aegean now lay wrecked or obsolete, and the skilled sailors who survived the war often sought better opportunities elsewhere. Trade routes shifted toward rising powers that had avoided the worst of the conflict, and Eretria's role as a major connector between East and West diminished. Politically, the strain weakened traditional elites, creating instability that made the city vulnerable in later centuries. Though Eretria did not disappear, it never again reached the prominence it had enjoyed before the war, becoming a cautionary example of how maritime power could be broken through prolonged conflict. Chalcis fared slightly better but paid its own heavy price. Control over the Lelantine plain brought less benefit than expected, as years of fighting had damaged the land and reduced its productivity. The aristocratic cavalry class that had once symbolized Chalcian strength faced growing resentment from common citizens who had borne the cost of war without sharing equally in its rewards. Internal tensions simmered beneath the surface, slowly reshaping social and political structures. Chalcis survived, but its dominance was checked, and its ambitions narrowed. Like Eretria, it emerged from the war older, poorer, and more cautious. Beyond Euboea, the Lelantine War influenced how Greek cities thought about power and conflict. The alliance networks formed during the war did not simply dissolve, they evolved into patterns of cooperation and rivalry that persisted for generations. Cities like Corinth and Miletus had gained valuable experience in projecting power beyond their immediate regions, learning how to balance military involvement with economic self-interest. Others learned the danger of being drawn too deeply into conflicts that offered little direct benefit. Neutrality, once seen as weakness, began to be viewed as a strategic choice. One of the most profound legacies of the war was its impact on Greek political development. The need to mobilize large numbers of citizen soldiers accelerated demands for broader participation in decision-making. While full democracy was still centuries away in most places, the seeds were planted as ordinary men began to see themselves not just as subjects but as stakeholders in the survival of their cities. War had forced them into formation, into shared risk and sacrifice, and that experience could not be easily undone. The connection between military service and political voice became stronger, reshaping the evolution of Greek city-states. Culturally, the Lelantine War entered Greek memory as a symbol of destructive rivalry. Later poets and thinkers looked back on it as a warning about the dangers of unchecked ambition and internal division. Though detailed contemporary records were scarce, the stories that survived emphasized how prosperity had bred conflict and how victory had proved hollow. These narratives influenced Greek attitudes toward later wars, reinforcing the idea that internal strife could be as damaging as foreign invasion. In this sense, the Lelantine War became part of a shared moral lesson, shaping how Greeks understood their own history. Economically, the conflict contributed to shifts in trade and colonization. As Chalcis and Eretria weakened, space opened for other cities to expand their influence. New centers of power emerged, particularly in regions that had remained relatively stable during the war. Colonies founded earlier gained greater autonomy, no longer tightly controlled by mother cities distracted by conflict. This decentralization helped spread Greek culture more broadly, even as it reduced the dominance of the original pioneers. Ironically, the war that began as a struggle for control over trade and land ended by diluting the very power it sought to secure. The Lelantine War also changed how Greeks prepared for the future. Fortifications improved, military organization became more systematic, and leaders grew more aware of the long-term costs of war. Yet these lessons did not lead to lasting peace. Instead, they made future wars more efficient and more devastating. The conflict had shown that Greek cities could endure decades of fighting without collapsing entirely, a realization that lowered the threshold for later wars. The idea that war was survivable, even normal, became embedded in Greek political culture. By the time memories of the war faded into legend, its influence remained deeply woven into Greek society. It had reshaped cities, altered alliances, and transformed attitudes toward power, war, and community. The Lelantine War was not remembered for a single heroic battle or a dramatic ending, but for the way it quietly redefined what it meant to be a Greek city-state in a competitive and dangerous world. Its shadow stretched forward into the conflicts that would later dominate Greek history, reminding future generations that some wars end not with triumph, but with lasting change. Long after the last weapons were lowered and the final skirmishes faded into memory, the Lelantine War continued to live on in consequences rather than victories, shaping the mindset of the Greek world in ways that few at the time could fully understand. What this conflict ultimately revealed was not the strength of any one city, but the fragile nature of power itself in an age driven by competition, honor, and survival. Chalcis and Eretria had entered the war believing dominance would secure their future, yet both emerged diminished, their earlier ambitions replaced by caution and internal repair. The war proved that even prosperous cities, when trapped in cycles of retaliation, could bleed themselves dry without achieving lasting security. This realization slowly spread across Greece, influencing how later generations approached both diplomacy and war. For ordinary people, the war's end did not erase the suffering it had caused. Fields once fought over remained scarred by neglect, families rebuilt without fathers or sons, and displaced populations struggled to reclaim stability. Veterans carried physical and psychological wounds into old age, while stories of raids, betrayals, and desperate defenses were passed down to children who had never seen peace as a given. These human costs rarely appear in lists of dates or alliances, yet they formed the true legacy of the conflict. The Lelantine War taught Greek societies that war was not a moment but a condition, one that could linger long after fighting stopped. Historically, the conflict stands as one of the earliest examples of large-scale Greek interstate warfare, a prototype for struggles that would later define the classical world. The alliances, strategies, and prolonged attrition seen here foreshadowed conflicts like the Persian Wars and, more ominously, the Peloponnesian War. Greeks learned that control of land meant little without secure trade, that naval power could challenge cavalry dominance, and that alliances could be both shields and traps. These lessons were paid for in blood and hardship, making them impossible to ignore. From this point forward, Greek cities would prepare for war not as an exception, but as an expectation. The Lelantine War also reshaped the moral conversation around conflict. Later thinkers reflected on how a shared culture and language had not prevented Greeks from turning against one another with devastating intensity. The war became a quiet warning embedded in collective memory, a reminder that internal rivalries could be more destructive than foreign threats. This awareness did not prevent future wars, but it influenced how Greeks explained them, justified them, and sometimes regretted them. The idea that victory could be hollow, that triumph might leave both sides weaker, began to take root. In the broader sweep of history, the war marked the end of an era of unchecked early expansion led by a few pioneering cities. As Chalcis and Eretria declined, power dispersed more widely across the Greek world. This diffusion allowed new centers to rise, contributing to the diversity and dynamism of Greek civilization. In a paradoxical way, the war that began as a struggle for dominance helped create a more balanced, if more contentious, Greek political landscape. The cost was enormous, but the transformation was lasting. What makes the Lelantine War especially compelling is not just its events, but what it reveals about human nature in times of rapid change. Prosperity bred fear, fear bred aggression, and aggression spiraled into decades of destruction. Neither side set out to create a war that would reshape Greek history, yet their inability to step back turned rivalry into catastrophe. This pattern, visible here in the 8th century BCE, would repeat itself across history in different forms, reminding us that the past is never as distant as it seems. Today, the Lelantine War may not be as famous as later Greek conflicts, but its importance lies in its role as a beginning. It was one of the first times the Greek world confronted the full cost of sustained internal war, and the lessons learned echoed for centuries. Understanding this conflict allows us to see how Greek warfare, politics, and society evolved from fragile beginnings into the complex systems that would later produce both extraordinary achievements and devastating conflicts. It stands as a reminder that history is often shaped not by clear victories, but by long struggles that force societies to adapt or decline. If you feel that our videos are giving you accurate, engaging, and valuable historical knowledge, then make sure to support the channel by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and pressing the bell notification button so you never miss our latest war history series, where we continue to explore the battles that shaped the ancient and modern world.